Well, good evening, students. As we ended class today, I promised you a video covering some of the topics that will be cut on tomorrow's quiz. Here is that promised video. In the next 10 minutes or so, I want to cover a few things. I want to begin with going over why these kinds of arguments matter. And then I want to briefly remind you of the pieces that go into making a syllogism. Then we're going to shift to talking about enthymemes, and then we'll wrap this up with Epicheiremas. I want to thank you all for working so hard at slogging through logic. This is, of course, my first year teaching logic and your first year learning it under this textbook. So I appreciate your patience as we kind of work through these things together. Well, let's start this particular video with why all of this matters. Why do we need to know different argument structures and understand how they work and solve them? Well, really, the fact is that throughout the rest of your life, arguments will always be made. Teachers will try to convince you, politicians will try to get your vote, advertisements will try to get your money. You will also always be making arguments, whether you're trying to convince someone to act in a certain way, to help you achieve a goal, or to partner with other people for some other purpose. Arguments are all around us. When we're aware of them, we're aware of their proper structure, we're able to act in better ways. We can't always determine whether something is true or false with the same kind of clarity that we can determine whether an argument is valid or invalid. Whether something is in fact true or false depends on a lot of other factors and really gets more into the realm of philosophy than of logic proper. But whether something is valid or invalid, that we can determine through using our reason. We can know which arguments are valid, and that can help us in two ways. It can help us avoid being suckered into foolish arguments, and it can help us keep ourselves from making foolish arguments. So if we're going to use argumentation, we should use the best argumentation. To that end, let me remind you of the first kind of argument we've been dealing with for several months now, and that is the syllogism. This is the basic kind of arguments. We've moved from just terms and words to propositions, and now at last to the argument. And the syllogism is the best form of the argument we've learned so far. It's pretty simple. It's made of 3 parts, 2 premises, and 1 conclusion. It works through the principle of comparison. If I can compare 2 unlike things to a similar thing, then I can draw a proper conclusion. Now, a syllogism is fairly basic, and that means it's pretty easy to determine if it is valid. Aristotle devised 6 very simple rules to quickly judge whether or not a syllogism is valid. I want to encourage you to think of judging the validity of a syllogism rather on the same level of thinking about building a house. When a house is built, a builder can make all kinds of decisions about how to build it. He can make expensive decisions or cheap decisions, long-term decisions or shortcuts. Now, but most state governments and local governments devise building codes that establish a minimum set of standards that every builder has to hit. If you're going to build a legal building that's for sale to other people, the standards establish the basics of what every building has to have. Safety and electricity, the quality of the plumbing, the quality of materials that go into the wall, the way the air conditioning is run. All of those have to be built according to certain standards. When we think about the syllogisms and the validity of a syllogism, we're comparing the syllogism to a set of standards. Is it legitimate? Is it a proper set of standards? Does it line up? Is it a valid argument? If the argument hits the set of standards, that doesn't mean that it's true or false. All that means is that the argument has hit the minimum level of standards to merit our attention. Now, if the argument sounds true on the face of it, but doesn't pass the test of validity, then really we don't need to bother with it. This is not an argument that really should persuade us in any significant way. So, we've got the syllogism, we've got a quick reminder of validity, and that's Aristotle's 6 rules. Let's talk about some of the new stuff we've been hitting over the last 2 weeks. First, and that takes us, of course, first to the enthymeme. An enthymeme is essentially a syllogism, but it is an argument shortcut. It's typically valid, but an enthymeme is going to have really has an implied premise. Instead of having 2 given premises leading to a given conclusion, an enthymeme is going to have one of those pieces left out. The example that I mentioned in class today involved cats. I think on previous videos I've had some of my cats show up. My wife and I have discovered that sometimes people don't want to come to our house because of cat allergies. Well, if we had already discussed that, instead of rehearsing all 3 pieces of an argument, I might tell somebody, you should not come to my house because we have cats. Now in that enthymeme, the conclusion is you should not come to my house, and the given premise, of course, is because we have cats. Now there's an implied premise there that we've already discussed. Because you have allergies and you're allergic to cats, you should not come to my house. That's the full stated argument. Now this enthymeme only gives one given premise and one conclusion. Now the trick with an enthymeme, as we learned last week, is you can go through a slow process and weed through and determine, based on the mood, determine what exactly goes in there. But the trick to solving these is really doing a couple things. If you write out the given premise and the given conclusion, and then treat it sort of like a puzzle. What are the pieces, the only possible pieces that could fit in the other premise to get to that conclusion? It shouldn't be terribly difficult to figure that out, because we know that we need a middle term to compare our two terms in the conclusion in, and that middle term is usually going to be in the one premise but not in the conclusion. So using our reason, we can figure out what has to go in that second premise. So by the end of an enthymeme, we should then have a syllogism, a given premise, an implied premise, and a conclusion. So that too is very similar to the syllogism, uses the same sort of structure. That takes us to the newest and, in a way, most complicated kind of argument. And that argument is called the Epicheirema. An Epicheirema is really building multiple arguments in and linking them together. Where this gets confusing is that it's a little tricky to sometimes figure out what is a premise and which is the conclusion, and then when is the argument building and transitioning. So this is, of course, another argument shortcut. The way the Epicheirema is structured is there's typically a syllogism given, except that the first premise is itself an enthymeme. So typically, then, that syllogism is going to be expanded to then be its own unique syllogism. Sometimes, then, once you expand that first syllogism, the conclusion of the first syllogism becomes the premise of the next syllogism that is in the Epicheirema. So what this gives us, think of this as a chain. The argument is functioning like a chain, except we have long pieces, those are your full syllogisms, and we have short pieces, those are your enthymemes. As you work through an Epicheirema, you're trying to figure out, what am I given, what are the premises, and then what am I given as far as conclusions, and then where are the enthymemes where I'm given just one premise and one conclusion, and I need to fill out the rest. So, in the trick to really solving an Epicheirema is this. You've really got to pay very close attention to the language used in the argumentation. As we talked about in a previous chapter, the language is often the clue to what is a premise and what is a conclusion. In tonight's homework, Epicheiremas 1 through 4 on page 282, the conclusions typically use the word therefore. That's our signal. That should be a giant red flag. Therefore is the conclusion of the matter. The premises are going to use the word since, for, and because. Those three words all signal a premise that is given. Now, then figuring out, sometimes those are next to each other, sometimes they're misarranged, and you really have to pull this whole thing apart and then rearrange it in certain ways so that it all makes sense. This really is this kind of argumentative exercise is really about you exercising your mind in a certain way. Can you go to an argument that's all packed in together, and can you tear it apart, put it in logical form, and analyze it and see how it all connects together? That's what we're about in these three different logical forms. So, in this video, we have reviewed the idea of the syllogism, the enthymeme, and the Epicheirema. In all three of these, we're really doing the same thing. We're checking arguments. We're looking for was the argument valid. But in order to test validity, we've got to get these into the proper form. So I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you all back for your quiz tomorrow.